Nobody called his name. Not once. Selim Rice stood in the middle of a packed banquet hall, trays being carried past him, voices cutting across each other, expensive shoes clicking on marble floors, and not a single person looked at him. Not to acknowledge him, not to thank him, not even to dismiss him, just through him, like he was air shaped like a person. He moved along the edges of the hall with a clean cloth and a bucket of soapy water, wiping down the baseboards, picking up discarded napkins, repositioning chairs that had been knocked crooked. His movements were quiet and precise. His shoes didn't squeak. His presence didn't register. He had learned, over years, how to become nearly invisible in rooms full of loud, important people. It was a skill, ugly as that was to admit. The Crestwood Banquet Hall sat 3 blocks inside the Meridian District boundary, which meant it belonged to a world that people like Selim only entered through service doors. Crystal chandeliers overhead, white tablecloths with pressed edges, floral arrangements taller than Selim himself. The kind of room that cost more to breathe in for one night than he made in 4 months. He wasn't supposed to be here for the event. He had come early to clean before the private gathering. A detail his supervisor, a wide woman named Mrs. Dolores Pratt, had emphasized 3 times with a pointed finger. You clean before they arrive. You leave before they sit. You do not linger. He had nodded each time. He always nodded, because speaking wasn't something Selim did. Not by choice. Not by trauma. It was simply the way his body had been built. His vocal cords produced nothing useful. A condition present since birth that no doctor in his price range had ever been able to explain or fix. He communicated through a small worn notebook he kept tucked in the front pocket of his uniform. Neat handwriting. Short sentences. He had learned early that long explanations irritated people who had already decided he wasn't worth the wait. So he kept his notes brief. And he kept his eyes open. Outside the hall's tall windows, the Meridian District glittered. Private cars sat double-parked along the curb. Men in dark suits moved in pairs near the entrance, earpieces visible if you knew what to look for. Selim knew what to look for. 3 years cleaning this hall had taught him things no one intended him to learn. Which families sat on which side of the room, which negotiations required the floral arrangements to be moved to create distance between chairs, which guests arrived through the kitchen entrance so no one logged their attendance. He knew better than to write any of it down in the notebook. That knowledge stayed locked in his chest. He wrung out his cloth, moved to the far corner, and knelt to wipe along the base of a decorative column. His knees ached. They always ached by Tuesday. His apartment, 1 room, a hot plate, a bathroom with a faucet that hissed when you ran the cold water, was a 20-minute walk from here. He'd been on his feet since 6 that morning. Halo would be waiting. That thought steadied him. It always did. The big black dog had a way of sitting directly in front of the door when Selim was overdue. Not pacing. Not barking. Just sitting. Square and patient, like he had already decided Selim was worth waiting for, and that was the end of the conversation. Selim allowed himself one small exhale that might have been a smile. He stood, moved toward the service cart, and began stacking the used cleaning rags. That was when the hall's double doors opened. Not the guest entrance. The private rear corridor, the one that didn't appear on the building's public floor plan. Selim didn't turn around. He had learned not to turn around. But he heard the shift in air pressure. The way conversations among the setup staff dropped to nothing in under 2 seconds. The way even the sound of folding chairs being arranged went quiet, like someone had pressed mute on a remote. He heard footsteps, measured, more than one person, moving in a formation rather than a crowd. Mrs. Pratt appeared at his elbow so fast he almost knocked the cart over. "Go," she whispered, not unkind, just urgent. "Service exit. Now, don't look back." He gathered his things, moved toward the side corridor. He did not look back, but as the service door swung shut behind him, he heard a voice, low even, carrying the particular kind of quiet that didn't need volume to fill a room. One sentence. He couldn't make out the words, but the entire hall responded to it. Powerful people rarely notice quiet kindness, but sometimes quiet kindness changes the course of power. Selim pushed through the exit door into the cold night air. That same night, the banquet hall was being prepared for a gathering so private that the building's security footage would later be wiped by morning. A gathering that Selim was absolutely not supposed to witness. He had almost made it out before he heard the second voice, closer than the first. Just beyond the door he was still holding open. Check the service corridor. 6 weeks earlier, it had been raining so hard the alley gutters were running white. Selim had been walking home from a double shift, the kind of shift that folded 2 jobs into one long gray stretch of hours, when he heard it. Not a bark, not a whimper, a sound somewhere in between, low, strained. The kind of sound that something makes when it has been hurting long enough that making noise seems almost pointless, but the body keeps doing it anyway. He stopped. The alley between Dunmore Street and the back of the laundry facility was narrow and poorly lit. A single orange street lamp threw a cone of wet light across the pavement. Dumpsters along the left wall, a chain-link fence on the right, and at the far end, half hidden in the shadow under the largest dumpster, something large and dark and still. Selim moved closer. The dog was enormous. Black coat, thick through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of build that told you immediately it wasn't a pet somebody let run loose. Trained, structured. Even lying on its side in a puddle of rainwater, it held itself with a particular tension, like it was conserving what it had left rather than giving in. There was blood, a wound along its left flank. Deep, wet. The dog turned its head toward Selim. Didn't growl. Didn't flinch. Just looked at him with amber eyes that were still sharp despite everything, like it was making a decision about him in real time. Selim crouched. He reached into his jacket pocket. Slowly, the way you move when you don't want to add to what something has already been through, and pulled out the small folded cloth he kept for his own cuts and scrapes. Pressed it gently to the wound. The dog didn't move. He had $11.40 in his account. He knew that without checking. He checked that morning while deciding whether to buy coffee or save it for bus fare, and the number had been sitting behind his eyes all day like a thorn. The nearest all-night pharmacy was 4 blocks back the way he came. He stood, looked down at the dog, looked up the alley. Made the decision in under 30 seconds. He walked the 4 blocks back through the rain. He spent $9.80. Antiseptic, gauze roll, medical tape, a small tin of high-protein dog food that the pharmacist raised an eyebrow at because it was clearly the most expensive item in the basket relative to everything else. He walked back. The dog was still there, still watching the entrance to the alley like it had been waiting to see if he came back. He came back. He knelt in the wet pavement and cleaned the wound slowly, the way he'd seen done once on a tutorial he'd watched on a library computer. The dog made the strained sound again when the antiseptic touched the cut. Once. Then it went still, like it had decided to let him work. He dressed the wound, wrapped it, opened the tin of food and set it down. The dog ate, not frantically, methodically, like it had manners even in a situation that had stripped most things away. Selim sat with his back against the dumpster in the rain while it finished eating. He thought about the $1.60 left in his account. He thought about the fact that this dog was clearly not a stray. The build, the discipline, the way it had looked at him, this was a working animal. Trained by someone, which meant it belonged somewhere. But right now it was here, and here was where he was. He opened his notebook, wrote one line in it, more to himself than anyone. You needed help. That was enough. He took off his jacket and laid it over the dog as much as he could. By morning, the rain had stopped. The dog was still there, still watching him. He named it Halo because of the way the early light came through the alley entrance that morning. A wide, low ring of white gold that framed everything from that angle. Seemed right. Compassion rarely asks if helping someone is convenient. Selim brought Halo home. He had no idea what that decision would cost him, or what it would eventually give him. Across the city, in a building with reinforced windows and a private elevator that required a key fob and a biometric scan just to reach the correct floor, a man sat in front of a wall of security monitors. He had not slept. He had not spoken to anyone in 6 hours except to say one thing: find the dog. And he was not a man accustomed to saying anything twice. The Drever brothers did not announce themselves. They didn't need to. When Aurelian walked into a room, people instinctively repositioned, not because he asked them to, but because the space around him seemed to require it. He was the kind of man who made calculations visible. You could almost see the variables running behind his eyes: distance, risk, timing, outcome. He spoke rarely. When he did, what he said tended to be the final word on a topic. Cashin arrived differently. Where Aurelian recalibrated a room, Cashin compressed it. He was broader through the frame, quieter in his movements, and carried a particular weight of authority that had nothing to do with volume. He didn't issue warnings. He didn't repeat himself. People who had worked for him long enough knew what the stillness before he spoke actually meant. Torvin came last and preferred it that way. He was the coldest of the three, not in cruelty but in methodology. Where Aurelian strategized and Cashin enforced, Torvin negotiated. He saw contracts the way a surgeon sees the body. Everything had a function, everything had a pressure point, and he had spent years learning exactly where both were located. He smiled often. His smile had never once meant what people assumed it meant. Together they ran the Drever organization. 3 territories, 12 districts, and a reach that extended well past the city's official boundaries into arrangements that no public record could trace. They were not identical, but they moved with the kind of synchronized precision that comes only from having survived the same things in the same order. 6 weeks ago, their primary security compound had been hit. The attack had been clean, targeted. Someone had gotten access to the compound layout, which meant someone inside had sold information, a problem that Torvin had already resolved in his particular way. 3 guards injured, 2 vehicles destroyed, and 1 asset missing. Halo. The dog had been stationed at the compound for 2 years. Sentinel grade. A breed developed specifically for high-security environments, trained to respond only to authorized personnel and to neutralize threats with a precision that made conventional guard dogs look approximate. He was not a pet. He was not decorative. He was a tactical element worth more in function than most of the staff combined. During the attack, Halo had been wounded and had broken through a compound fence in the chaos. The tracker embedded in his collar had been damaged in the same incident, a detail that had cost the tech responsible for its maintenance a conversation with Cashin that the man had not walked away from comfortably. The citywide search had been running for 6 weeks. Nothing. Until the surveillance footage came in from a street camera 3 blocks south of the attack site. Aurelian had flagged it during an overnight review. A timestamp from the night of the attack, 6 hours after the breach. Low resolution, rain-blurred, but usable. A figure in a damp jacket crouched at the entrance of an alley, carrying a large dark dog, moving slowly, carefully, the way you move when you're carrying something you don't want to drop. Cashin watched the footage twice. Then a 3rd time, not because the image was unclear, because something about it required a second look. The figure was slight, moving alone through a district that most people with options didn't walk through at night, especially not in a rainstorm. No car waiting, no phone visible, just a person in a wet jacket, carrying an injured dog, moving toward a bus stop. Aurelian ran the partial image through their network contacts within 48 hours. The result came back. Selim Rice. 23 years old. No documented PAC affiliation. Omega designation. Mute, communication by written notation. Address. A single-room rental in the Colton Ward District, 4 miles south of the Meridian boundary. Employment. Part-time cleaning staff at Crestwood Banquet Hall and a second job 3 mornings a week at a laundry facility. No family listed. No emergency contacts. Cashin read the file once. set it down, picked it up again. Powerful men often believe loyalty can be bought. But loyalty born from kindness is something money cannot command. He went back to the footage. Halo had not resisted. That was the thing. A sentinel dog trained to that level did not allow contact from unknown individuals. Not under stress. Not injured. Not under any condition that hadn't been specifically trained for. But in the footage, grainy as it was, the dog was still. Completely still. Head resting against the figure's chest as it was carried. Not sedated. Cashin knew what sedated looked like. Calm. The dog looked calm. Cashin watched the clip again, because that was the part he couldn't move past. The night the Drever brothers came to Crestwood, Selim knew something was different before he saw anyone walk through the door. The setup staff moved faster. The florists, who were usually slow and conversational, finished in under 40 minutes and left without speaking to each other. Mrs. Pratt circulated through the hall 3 times in 1 hour, checking the placements of things she had already approved. The kitchen staff behind the service partition went from the usual low, steady noise to almost nothing. Rooms didn't behave this way for ordinary guests. Selim worked his section, the eastern corridor and the adjacent main floor perimeter, and kept his attention on the surfaces in front of him. Tablecloths, chair alignment, the small details that kept him employed. Then the pheromones hit. It wasn't a smell exactly, more like a change in pressure. A shift in the air that registered somewhere beneath conscious thought. A signal that something large and dominant had entered the space and the rest of the room needed to recalibrate around it. Selim felt his shoulders draw inward slightly. An involuntary response. He noticed it, set it aside. He did not look up. From the edge of his peripheral vision, he tracked 3 figures crossing the main floor. Dark suits, measured pace, the kind of movement that didn't ask for space but simply occupied it. The room's ambient noise dropped around them the way it had in the service corridor 6 weeks ago. Same voice. He recognized the register now. He kept his cloth moving along the baseboard rail. That was when Halo stood up. Selim had brought Halo tonight because Mrs. Pratt, who had met the dog exactly once and decided he was well-behaved enough for the pre-event shift, had allowed it on the condition that he stayed in the eastern corridor and remained out of sight. Halo had been sitting quietly beside the service cart for the better part of an hour. Now he was on his feet, not aggressive, not pulling, just standing with that particular squared-up posture that meant his attention had fully locked onto something. Then he made a sound. Low, not a growl. Something in the register below a growl. A sound of recognition. Selim turned. One of the 3 men had stopped. Not Aurelian, who continued toward the private dining area without breaking stride. Not Torvin, who paused briefly and then followed. The one who stopped was the broadest of the 3. Dark coat, eyes that moved across the room in the same systematic way Selim had watched through glass weeks ago on the security monitor reflection he'd caught in passing. Cashin Drever. He wasn't looking at Halo. He was looking at Selim. The eye contact lasted for seconds. Maybe 5. Selim didn't look away. Not because he was brave. Because something in his chest had gone very quiet, and the part of him that usually sent the signal to lower his eyes didn't send anything at all. Cashin looked at him the way someone looks at a thing they've been trying to place, working backward from a partial image, filling in the details they hadn't been able to confirm. Then he looked at Halo. Halo had not moved, still standing, still squared. The sound had stopped, but the attention hadn't. Cashin crouched, not quickly, with the deliberate ease of a man who didn't consider the floor beneath him anything to hesitate over. He reached out one hand toward the dog, low, palm open. Halo stepped forward. Let him. Something shifted in Cashin's expression. Barely visible. A compression at the corners of the mouth that wasn't quite a frown and wasn't quite a smile. More like a calculation reaching its result. He straightened. Looked back at Selim once more. Then he walked away, into the private dining corridor. Without a word, Selim stood holding his cleaning cloth. His heartbeat was doing something irregular. He told himself it was the pheromone pressure. He turned back to the baseboard. He told himself that was the end of it. A strange moment. Nothing more. Men like that didn't circle back to cleaning staff. Men like that had lives structured entirely around not having to. He finished his shift, collected Halo, walked home. 14 days passed. Then 3 weeks. Selim worked his schedule, cleaned his section, saved what he could, fed Halo the good food first and ate whatever was left. He stopped thinking about the 5 seconds of eye contact. Almost. Then, on a Thursday morning, a black car stopped in front of his building. Not circling, not slowing. Stopped. Directly in front. And it sat there. The man who stepped out of the car was not one of the 3 brothers. Selim watched from his window, 3 floors up, curtain pulled back 2 inches, as the figure crossed the sidewalk toward the building entrance. Tall. Well-dressed in a way that read expensive without announcing it. A gray coat, hair cut close at the sides, moving with the easy confidence of a person who had never in his life wondered whether he was allowed to enter a space. The intercom buzzed 11 minutes later. Selim didn't answer. It buzzed again. He pulled out his notebook, wrote nothing, just held the pen. The buzzing stopped. 30 seconds later, his building super. A man named Odell who Selim had never seen move faster than a slow shuffle. Knocked on his door with an expression that suggested he had been asked to knock and found the request impossible to refuse. "There's a gentleman downstairs," Odell said, not meeting Selim's eyes. "Says he has a business matter. Says it won't take long." Selim wrote, "Who is he?" Odell glanced at the note, looked at the floor. He said his name is Varric Halden. The name meant nothing to Selim, but the car outside had plates he recognized from the Meridian District, and the way Odell was standing in the doorway, slightly turned like he might need to move quickly, told Selim that the polite option here was to go downstairs. He put on his jacket, touched Halo's head once, went downstairs. Varric Halden was standing in the building's small front lobby with his hands clasped in front of him, looking at the cracked tile floor with the particular expression of a man making a continuous private effort not to show what he thought of a place. He looked up when Selim came through the stairwell door. He took in Selim's appearance, the second-hand jacket, the notebook in his hand, the absence of any reaction on Selim's face, and something adjusted in his approach. A recalibration, like he had expected either more or less and was now working with the actual subject. "Selim Rice." Not a question. Selim nodded. "I'll be brief." Varric reached into his coat and produced a folded document. Thick paper. Official looking. He held it out. "This is a contract proposal. The short version is this. You and I marry at a ceremony 6 weeks from today. In exchange, your current debts are erased. I've already confirmed the amounts. And you receive housing in a secured residential property in the Meridian District, along with a monthly security stipend." Selim did not take the document. He wrote in his notebook, held it up. "Why me?" Varric looked at the words, then back at Selim. "Political alignment. My family requires an Omega spouse to finalize a territory arrangement. The requirements for the contract were specific. No existing pact ties. No family who might contest terms. Clean record." He paused. "You qualify." Selim looked at the document. He wrote again. "What if I decline?" Varric's expression didn't change, but the answer took a half-second longer than it should have. "Then your lease renewal, which your landlord tells me comes up in 19 days, may face some complications. And the second position at the laundry facility, the one that covers your utilities, was recently acquired by a holding company that reviews its staffing contracts monthly." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm not threatening you. I'm giving you a clear picture." The lobby was quiet. Odell had disappeared. Selim stood very still. He thought about the 19 days. He thought about the lease. He thought about Halo upstairs, and the dog food he'd had to stretch across 10 days last month. He thought about what choices actually looked like when the floor beneath them had already been removed. The poor are often told they have choices. But sometimes those choices are only different forms of survival. He took the document, didn't open it, just held it. Varric nodded once. A transaction completed. A car will contact you 48 hours before the ceremony for fitting arrangements. He turned toward the exit. Welcome to the arrangement, Mr. Rice. The door closed behind him. Selim stood in the lobby holding a document that had just restructured his entire future without asking whether he wanted it to. He looked down at the contract. He looked back at the stairs. 6 weeks. The wedding was scheduled for the first Saturday of the following month. At Crestwood Banquet Hall. The same hall where he mopped floors 3 times a week. The same hall where, 5 weeks ago, a man with amber-sharp eyes had crouched in front of Halo and looked at Selim like he was something worth locating. Selim walked back up the stairs. Halo was sitting directly in front of the door when he reached the landing. Square and patient, watching him, and somewhere across the city, in a building with reinforced windows and a private elevator, a wall of security monitors flickered with new footage. A gray coat, a black car, Crestwood. An envelope passed. Cashin Drever watched the clip without moving. Then he reached for his phone. Hi viewers. Have you ever had to make a choice that wasn't really a choice? Something you said yes to because every other option had already been taken away? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to hear your story. The dress shirt was the wrong size. Selim had known it the moment the tailor's assistant, a young woman who did not make eye contact and who spoke only to the woman beside her, had handed it across the counter without measuring him first. Too wide in the shoulders, too long in the sleeve, like it had been ordered for someone they assumed he would be, rather than the person actually standing in front of them. He hadn't written anything in his notebook about it. He just folded the sleeves back and wore it. That was how the first meeting with Varric Halden's household went. Uncomfortable, imprecise, and nobody in the room was interested in adjusting. The fitting was held in a private suite inside a building Selim had never been allowed past the lobby of before. Marble floors again. Climate that cost money just to maintain. 3 staff members moving around him like he was a mannequin that had been placed slightly off-center, and they hadn't decided yet whether to bother fixing it. Varric was present for 11 minutes. He reviewed the suit jacket options, made 2 quick selections, gave a short directive to the nearest staff member about the ceremony timeline, and left. He didn't speak to Selim. Not once. Not a greeting. Not an instruction. Not even the basic acknowledgement that Selim was a person sharing the room with him. Selim stood on the fitting platform in the too-wide shirt and watched the door close behind Varric and thought, this is what the next phase of my life looks like. That was the moment it became real. He had held the contract for 3 weeks, slept with it sitting on the edge of his small table like a thing he kept needing to decide about even though the decision had already been made. He had read it 4 times. The language was clean and final. Debts erased. Housing secured. Monthly stipend. All conditional on his compliance with the arrangement for a minimum term of 2 years. 2 years. He had spent the previous night sitting on the floor of his apartment with Halo's head in his lap. Not sleeping, just thinking. Halo had not liked the car that came for the fitting. Not the car itself. Halo moved through new environments without anxiety, which was one of the things Selim had noticed early. But when the driver opened the door and the pheromone trace inside the vehicle hit, a residue from whoever else had been transported in it, Halo had gone still. His head had dropped slightly. Not fear. Something more considered than fear. Assessment. And his assessment had been no. He had looked at Selim. Selim had gotten in anyway. Because what choice looked like at this point was getting in anyway. He spent the ride watching the Meridian District fill the windows. Wide streets, private security at building entrances, cars that cost more than his yearly income parked along curbs like they were ordinary. He thought about how a place this close could feel this far. The fitting ended. The car brought him back. He climbed the stairs, put the notebook on the table, fed Halo, stood at the window for a while. Meanwhile, 3 miles northeast, Cashin Drever sat in a chair at his desk without moving for a long time after Torvin delivered the information about the marriage contract. Torvin laid it out clean. No editorializing. That was how Torvin worked. Facts, sequence, implication. The Omega from the surveillance footage. The one who'd carried Halo through a rainstorm. Varric's arrangement team had identified him as a viable contract candidate 6 weeks after the compound breach. Financially exposed. No protective ties. Easy to pressure. They had pressured him. He had signed. The ceremony was in 12 days. Torvin waited. Cashin didn't say anything for a moment. Then, what hall? Torvin told him. Cashin stood up. He moved toward the window. Looked at the city. Prepare the car. Torvin glanced at Aurelian, who was sitting on the far side of the room reviewing a separate file. Aurelian didn't look up, but the corner of his mouth moved. Which one? Torvin asked. Cashin answered without turning around. The wedding car. The flowers were white. Hundreds of them. Roses and something else Selim couldn't name. Arranged in tall standing displays along both sides of the center aisle. The chandeliers had been lowered to half intensity, which gave the whole hall a warm gold glow that probably looked beautiful in photographs. Selim stood at the front of the room in the suit they had chosen for him and thought, I clean this floor every Tuesday. The ceremony was set to begin in 4 minutes. The hall was full. He hadn't expected that. He had assumed a political arrangement would be attended by the necessary parties only. A few witnesses, whoever needed to sign what needed to be signed, and then out. But the hall held nearly 200 people. Most of them were Varric's. Extended family, business associates. A few faces Selim recognized from his cleaning shifts, as men who sat in the private dining room and never spoke above a murmur. Nobody from Selim's side. There wasn't a side to fill. He stood where he had been placed and held his notebook at his side and kept his breathing level. Halo was not here. Mrs. Pratt had agreed, reluctantly and for a sum Selim hadn't asked about, to look after him during the ceremony. He felt the absence of the dog the way you feel a missing tooth. Not pain exactly, but a gap where something steady used to be. Varric arrived at the front of the room with 2 minutes to spare. Dressed impeccably. Expression composed. He glanced at Selim once with the same look he'd used in the fitting suite. Functional, passing, like checking a detail on a list. Then he turned forward. The officiant, a tall man with silver-rimmed glasses, opened the ceremony with the standard language. Selim had never attended a wedding before. He hadn't expected the words to sound so clean when the situation under them was this unclean. The officiant was 3 sentences into the formal vows when the doors opened. Not the side doors. The main entrance. Both panels. Simultaneously. The sound alone stopped the room. It wasn't loud. Just final. The way a period lands at the end of a sentence you didn't see coming. 3 men walked in. The 200 people who had been watching the altar turned to watch the entrance instead. A ripple of movement across the hall. Heads turning, chairs shifting, a sound passing through the crowd that wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite silence but was somewhere between the two. Selim knew who they were before he saw their faces. The pheromone shift came first. Aurelian on the left, Torvin on the right, Cashin in the center. He walked like the room was already his and had been since before he arrived. Dark suit, no tie. Eyes moving across the hall the way they had in the surveillance footage, the way they had the night of the banquet, systematic, complete, landing on everything worth noting and releasing everything that wasn't. They landed on Selim, and stayed. Varric turned. The hall went very, very quiet. Cashin walked the length of the center aisle without rushing, without looking at Varric, without acknowledging the officiant or the flowers or the 200 people watching. He walked like there was only one point in the room and he was already moving toward it. He stopped in front of Selim. This close, Selim could see the detail in the silver chain in his right hand. Thin, precise, with a small flat clasp. Not jewelry. Not ceremonial. Something with weight to it that he couldn't name. Cashin reached forword. Slowly. With the same deliberate care he had used in the banquet hall when he crouched toward Halo. He placed the silver chain around Selim's neck and fastened the clasp. The sound of it clicking shut was the only sound in the room. A territorial protection mark. Old protocol. The kind that predated contracts and ceremonies and everything else in this hall. In the world these men operated in, that chain meant one thing and everyone present knew exactly what it meant. The gasps came then. All at once. From every corner. Varric moved. You have no standing in this contract. His voice was level, but the edges of it were fraying. This arrangement was properly filed. The terms are legally binding under. The Omega is under my protection. Cashin didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room absorbed the words and went still again. Varric straightened. A muscle in his jaw worked once. On what basis? Cashin turned his head slightly and looked at Varric for the first time since entering the room. Just looked at him. 1 full second. Varric stopped talking. Cashin turned back to Selim and asked one question. Did you save this dog? The question hung over the room like weather. Selim held Cashin's gaze, then nodded once. Cashin turned to face the hall. Not Varric specifically. The whole room. Like what he was about to say needed to be heard by everyone present, and he wasn't going to say it twice. Halo is a sentinel security animal, trained for high-threat environments over a 2-year period. The cost of that training exceeds what most people in this city earn in a decade. He let that sit. He bonds to one individual. One. Not a handler. Not an owner. A compatible match, determined by pheromone stability under extreme stress. The hall was motionless. During a breach at our compound 6 weeks ago, Halo was injured and displaced. Standard protocol dictates that a compromised sentinel either returns to its last secured location or neutralizes any attempted contact. He paused. He did neither. Cashin looked at Selim. He allowed a stranger, a mute Omega walking alone at night through a storm, to carry him through an alley, treat a wound, and bring him home. A sound moved through the crowd. Not words. Something beneath words. That doesn't happen. Cashin's voice didn't change. Steady. Even. The kind of voice that carried more weight precisely because it refused to perform. Not with a dog trained at his level. Not under those conditions. What it means, what it has always meant, is that the individual Halo accepted carries a stabilization frequency. A pheromone signature rare enough that it has no standard classification. He let another beat of silence pass. People with that frequency don't just calm dogs. The implication hit the room all at once. Stabilization frequency. That was the phrase that changed everything. In the world these men operated in, where alpha pheromone storms during high-pressure negotiations had ended alliances, where the wrong room combination had destroyed deals worth more than buildings, a person who could neutralize that chemistry without trying wasn't just valuable. They were strategic. The room realized it in stages. Selim watched it happen from the front of the room. The shift moving outward through the crowd like a current. The moment when people stopped seeing a mute Omega in a borrowed suit and started seeing something else entirely. Not weak. Not easy to control. Something rarer than that. Varric was very still. The calculation behind his eyes had changed completely. He had selected Selim specifically for vulnerability, for the absence of protection, for the ease of the arrangement. And now the same room full of witnesses who had watched him execute that strategy was watching it come apart at the clasp of a silver chain. Aurelian spoke for the first time since entering. From the side of the room, quiet, measured. The pheromone compatibility assessment our system runs on identified his frequency 8 days after Halo returned to the compound. A pause. We had already located him by then. We chose to wait and see what Varric's team would do. The room absorbed that. They waited. They watched what Varric would do. And Varric had handed them exactly what they needed. Torvin, still standing near the entrance, had not moved or spoken. But he turned his head slightly toward a man near the back of the hall, one of Varric's legal contacts, and the man sat down very carefully and did not look up again. Cashin reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He withdrew a thick envelope. He set it on the altar beside the unsigned ceremony documents. It landed with a weight that everyone could hear. That covers the debts Varric used to pressure the contract. He looked at Selim. And then some. The hall waited, because this was the moment. The Omega had been handled, leveraged, and maneuvered into a room full of powerful people who had decided his future without consulting him. And now the most feared alpha in the territory had just placed a life-changing sum of money directly in front of him. Everyone expected him to take it. Selim looked at the envelope. He looked at it for a long time. The hall waited. 200 people and a complete, pressing silence. He could see the numbers without opening it. The thickness of it told him enough. It was more money than he had ever been adjacent to. More than would fix the lease and the utilities and the gap months and the debt that had been held over him like a ceiling he could never reach past. He reached out, picked it up. The crowd exhaled slightly. Then Selim held the envelope out, back toward Cashin. The hall went so still it was almost physical. Cashin didn't move. Selim opened his notebook. He wrote with the envelope still balanced in his other hand, the pen moving quickly, the handwriting clean. He turned the notebook toward Cashin. I didn't save him for payment. Cashin read it. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Not surprise. Something slower than surprise. A settling. The way a calculation looks when the final result turns out to be different from every variable you accounted for, and you're deciding whether to recalculate or accept the answer. He accepted it. He took the envelope back. The room, which had been quiet before, went into a different kind of quiet. Not shock. Recognition. Because people who move in rooms where everything has a price understand, on some fundamental level, the difference between a person who doesn't know what they're worth and a person who has simply already decided that some things are not for sale. Varric made a sound. Not quite a word. A single man near the center of the room laughed, short, involuntary. Then caught himself. Aurelian turned away slightly, and the angle of his shoulders said everything about what he was thinking without him having to say a word. Torvin looked at the ceiling for exactly 2 seconds and then looked back down. Cashin stood in front of Selim with the envelope in his hand and the silver chain sitting against Selim's collar and said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at the chain. Then at Selim. The integrity cannot be purchased. That was what the room had just watched. Not a performance. Not a calculated move. Not someone playing a longer game for greater leverage. Just a person who had spent his last $9 on a dog he didn't own and meant it completely. The moment power recognizes integrity, the balance between them changes. Cashin turned to Varric. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't need to. The contract is void. Varric's jaw tightened. You don't have the authority to. The terms were constructed through financial coercion of an unaffiliated Omega. Torvin's voice came from the side, smooth as a legal brief. Under district protocol, that makes it unenforceable before an alpha jurisdiction review. Which you know. A pause. Which is why you moved the ceremony up by 2 weeks. The blood left Varric's face. Not all at once. In stages. Cashin held his gaze for exactly as long as it needed to be held. Then he turned away, back toward Selim. He held out the envelope one more time. Selim looked at him. Cashin's expression said, "This time it's not about what you did. It's about what you deserve. There's a difference." Selim took it. He held it carefully. Not the way you hold something you're going to spend. The way you hold something you're still deciding what to do with. The hall began to breathe again. Not fully, but enough. Cashin looked at the altar, at the ceremony documents that had never been signed. He picked them up and tore them down the center. The sun was coming through the cathedral windows at an angle that made the whole entrance look like something out of a painting Selim had once seen on a library wall. He stood outside the hall in the too-wide suit with the silver chain still around his neck and the envelope in his jacket pocket and thought, I don't know what happens now. Halo was going to need his afternoon walk. That was the thought. After all of that, the contract, the hall, the chain, the torn documents, 200 people watching a man he barely knew dismantle an arrangement that had been built specifically around his inability to resist it. The clearest thought in his head was about the dog's walk. He almost wanted to write that down. He didn't. Cashin came through the main doors alone. Aurelian and Torvin had remained inside. Selim had watched them through the glass. Still working, still talking, still managing whatever the immediate aftermath of this required. Torvin had his phone out. Aurelian was speaking quietly to two men Selim didn't recognize. Whatever this had been, it wasn't finished for them yet. But Cashin had come outside. He stood beside Selim for a moment without speaking, looking at the street. 3 armored cars sat along the curb, quiet, waiting. Then he turned. I have an offer. He said it simply, not preamble, not positioning, not a contract, not an arrangement. Selim looked at him. A job, a real one. He paused. The pheromone stabilization aspect is part of it. I won't pretend otherwise. High-pressure negotiations are a consistent problem in our operations. Your presence in those rooms would change the outcomes. Selim's expression didn't shift. Cashin held up one hand slightly. Not a gesture of defense. More like, I'm not finished. But that's not the whole reason. He looked at the street, then back. Halo has been operational for 2 years. He has been in 3 live threat situations. He does not respond to strangers. He does not allow unsolicited contact. He does not go calm. A beat. Until he let that land. That tells me something about your judgment, your patience, the way you respond to something that's frightened and damaged without trying to force it into something it isn't ready for. A long pause. Those qualities are rarer than you know. And in the world I operate in, they are worth more than most things I can name. Selim looked down at the notebook in his hand. He had spent his entire life being invisible to rooms exactly like the one he had just left. Being the person who cleaned the floors before the important people arrived. Being the detail no one accounted for. Being easy to pressure precisely because everyone assumed that nothing he said would carry weight. And now the most feared alpha in the territory was standing outside a cathedral telling him he was worth something. Not to be used. Not to be owned. To be trusted. He opened the notebook. He thought about the lease with 19 days left. The laundry job. The hot plate. The way he stretched dog food across 10 days when the money ran short and never once resented it. He thought about the way Halo had sat directly in front of his door every time he came home late. Square and patient. Like he had already decided Selim was worth waiting for. He wrote 2 words. Turned the notebook toward Cashin. Halo stays. Cashin read it. The corner of his mouth moved. Just barely. Halo stays. Selim turned the page. Wrote again. Yes. Power isn't measured by how loudly someone commands a room. Sometimes power is simply the courage to stay kind, even when the world gives you every reason not to. They walked toward the cars. Behind them, through the cathedral glass, Aurelian watched them reach the curb. He said nothing, but he turned to Torvin, who was still on his phone. Torvin glanced at the window, at the street, at Cashin opening the car door. He lowered his phone. They had spent 2 years watching Cashin Drever move through high-pressure rooms like weather that didn't answer to anything. They had watched him negotiate, enforce, and decide, always at the same temperature. Always at the same controlled distance. Nothing reached him. Nothing moved him. Until now. Torvin looked at Aurelian. Aurelian looked back. They both understood what they had just watched. Cashin, the most feared alpha in 4 districts, had met the one person whose quiet presence lowered the pressure in the room simply by being in it. Not because he had been trained to. Not because it was a skill he had developed. Because it was who he was. And that kind of bond doesn't just change a man. It changes everything built around him. Dynasties have shifted for less. If the story moved you, even one moment of it, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that being quiet doesn't mean being powerless. Drop a comment telling me the moment that hit hardest. Was it when Selim spent his last $9? Was it when he pushed the envelope back? Or was it the 2 words at the end? Your comments keep these stories alive. And if you are new here, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every story on this channel is built around one idea, that ordinary people carry extraordinary strength. You do not want to miss what comes next. See you in the next one.